Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Sportsbook Confidential. My name is John Sullivan, and I'm your host. And this little show here is to help you learn and grow as a sports bettor. And we're live at the FingerLakes1.com studios in Seneca Falls, New York. And before I get started with the show, I just want to point out I'm getting my pointing really good these days. You can call a show and leave feedback, comments, questions, advice, overall encouragement to our phone number. We have our own voicemail system for the show, 866-315-FLX1, extension 810. There's a different extension for every program here on the network. So please remember that if you do call in that we may play your call on the air. So please keep that in mind. Glad to be back. We had some technical difficulties last week, and it was very frustrating for me, but we're going to try it again this week. And as we always do, I'm going to start my program off by updating my bankroll. And this is from the plays from actually 2 weeks ago, since our show did not fully record last week. So I had a starting bankroll of $652, and we had the Rangers money line on Friday that week, and we had 3 basketball games in the Ivy League also that week. So the Rangers lost, and that was a loss of $22 for us, and we came very close to sweeping the 3 basketball games, but the Princeton game lost for us. It was a one-possession game very late, but they ended up losing by 14. They just let it get away from them. So that was a loss for us. And then we had Penn winning outright, plus $21, and Columbia lost in double overtime. They almost won outright, plus $21. So it was a net loss of $2 that week. So our bankroll is $650. And as I divide by 30, as I always do to come up with a new bet size, the bet size is $22 going forward into this week. So not much of a change there, but, this is a kind of an in-between for me with the sports betting schedule. Pro football is over. College basketball is coming up on their conference tournaments. Unfortunately, their regular season does not bode well for Friday handicapping. Their games on Saturday and Sunday usually do not have lines out till the evening before the game, so we broadcast too early for that. But one thing that has started is NASCAR, and I was planning on doing this for the Daytona 500, but since we had technical difficulties last week, I'm going to repeat this lesson and with sound, and we're going to talk about betting on auto racing in today's sportsbook lesson. And NASCAR runs from last Sunday all the way through November, right before Thanksgiving, about 2 weeks before Thanksgiving. And they only take, I think, 4 weeks off during the year. So there's 36 weeks of racing. And the sportsbooks will offer wagering on the big racing series, the NASCAR series, of course, and Formula One, and IndyCar racing. And the sports books will usually offer 3 types of bets. And the first one is odds to win, where they will list most of the drivers and give odds to win on each driver. And then they have what's called head-to-head, and that's where they pick 2 drivers, and whichever driver finishes higher in the race, the finish higher in the race, wins the head-to-head. And depending on the strength of the drivers, the odds could be they could be equal or very heavily weighted to one side or the other. And then the third, it's a little tougher to find this, but I call it group odds, where they will pick a group of drivers. They do this in golf a lot. They'll pick a group of drivers or a group of golfers, and then they have different odds for, say, 5 different golfers, and whichever one of the 5 finishes highest at the end of the event wins. And same with racing. They'll pick 5 drivers, and whichever one finishes highest of the 5 wins the bet at whatever odds were given for each driver. So those are the basic types of wagers you can make if you're going to bet on an auto race. And since NASCAR is not only the most popular here in the U.S., but it's the most widely available on television. Formula One is all over the world, but sometimes their events are 6 o'clock in the morning or 11 o'clock at night, depending on what time zone they're in. And IndyCar really only has a few races that people are really interested in. So let's talk about handicapping NASCAR. And there are some handicapping tips I have for you. Unfortunately, because the practices and qualifying hasn't happened yet this week, I don't have any practical examples to show you yet. But we will talk about different ways you can look at a NASCAR race and handicap who you think may win. So the first is driver history and track history. And there's a website, I think it's called Driver Averages, that you can go to, driveraverages.com, where you can go and see how a driver does on a specific track. It'll have how many, top fives, top tens, obviously how many wins, how many laps led, average start, average finish, these kind of things, to help you get an idea if one particular driver has a dominant skill set in a particular type of track. Now, you got to understand in NASCAR, there's not just ovals, although the majority are. There's a couple of road races, but there's different size tracks. There's short tracks. Some drivers exceed very well on those shorter tracks. Some drivers exceed very well on the huge super speedways with restrictor plates. And then there's a bunch of tracks that are in between, usually 1.5 or 2 miles, that are more of like a few mileage race. And some teams, not necessarily the drivers, but the teams are better at bringing home a win based on fuel mileage, where they made less pit stops than other people. And then you have the track history. Drivers not specifically tied to a track, but to a type of track. There are, some drivers or teams that are, excel at these, these cookie cutter tracks, the medium level tracks. But you can also gather from track history, if you're looking at a specific race, the average number of cautions, the average, mile per hour, the average fuel mileage, all kinds of things you can consider when determining who you might want to wager on in a given race. And then here is a what I think is, I call a quick and dirty way to handicap a NASCAR race, and it's called opening odds, closing odds. And what I'm going to show you right now real quick is a website that has the current odds for this Sunday's NASCAR race. And let me just move it a little bit. If I can find my mouse. Here we go. There you go. So you can see right up here at the top of the screen, it's the odds to win this Sunday's NASCAR race, the 500-mile race in Atlanta. And these are the opening odds because there has been no practice and no qualifying, official practice or qualifying. And this is what the Sportsbook has put out. And you can see there's about 20 drivers listed. I believe they run a max of 40 drivers now in a NASCAR race. And these are the opening odds. Now, you look at these and you take a snapshot of this and you, keep it in your back pocket. And then when you get to Sunday morning, you go back and you look at the odds again. And you compare. What you're looking for is which driver's odds have dropped the most. If somebody went from 200 to 1 to 50 to 1, that means somebody put significant money on that, or something happened to give that driver a much better chance to win. Maybe he got in a different car, or somebody that the Sportsbook respects, having a professional opinion on the race, gave that person a better chance to win. So you might see somebody go from 20 to 1 to 5 to 1, or you might see somebody go from 100 to 1 to 15 to 1. And that can also be applied to fantasy sports. If you're playing fantasy NASCAR, the drivers' prices don't change in fantasy NASCAR. So that driver just went from 100 to 1 to 15 to 1. That means that he is expected to exceed, he is expected to overachieve, I should say, in those circumstances. And you'll be looking for him to perform well. So, and also carrying into one of the things that really helped me with NASCAR fantasy and I also look for, if I'm betting on a driver to win, is something called lead lap finishes. And lead lap finishes means the driver finishes the race on the same lap that the winner did, even though he didn't finish first. He's on, he could have finished 8th or 12th even, but he's still on the lead lap. He was on the same lap as the winner was. And that tells me a couple of things. It tells me that the driver knows how to bring the car home and keep the car competitive. Some drivers will use up the brakes. They'll take chances. They cannot save the tires. They cannot get fuel mileage, which is not always their fault. But the drivers that have a significant number of lead lap finishes means that they will be in contention for a win if you're going to bet on a driver to win. So that is one stat specifically that I look for when I'm wagering on a NASCAR race. Now, there's two specific kinds of NASCAR races that are outside of the norm. And the first one is a restrictor plate race. And the Daytona 500 last week was a restrictor plate race. Because the speeds get so high for the cars, they actually put a metal plate on top where the pistons go on top of the engine block, and it restricts the horsepower. What that does is it makes all the cars very equally powered. Some drivers do not take the qualifying very seriously for the restrictor plate races because you can be 30th place in a restrictor plate race in one lap, and you can be in the top 5 in the next. It has a lot to do with drafting, because much like the Tour de France in bicycles, the teams will line up and form trains, aerodynamic trains that allow them to go faster, and teams will draft. Pairs of drivers will draft with each other, and knowing who the draft partners are is very key in wagering on these races. But there's also a lot of luck involved because this restrictor plate races often have big wrecks. And if you watched the Daytona 500 last week, there was a 28-car wreck out of 40 cars that were in the field. I don't even think 40 cars were left when that happened. It was in the last 10 laps. But there's 2 races at Daytona and 2 races at Talladega, 4 total for the year, and they are restrictor plate races. They're the only ones, and you have to keep in mind that qualifying really doesn't count for those races, and drafting partners are very important. And over time, you can see which teams are very good at restrictor plate racing. And then finally, what I call the Road Warriors. There are 2 road courses in the NASCAR circuit. I wish there were more. I feel like that's very exciting racing. Of course, we have right here down the road, we have Watkins Glen, and then there's Sonoma, California. There are some drivers that are hired to drive cars just for the road courses. They're hired guns, but there are some drivers that really do well because these races are the only races where you really have to turn both right and left. And I find them to be very exciting, and there's a lot of bumping and, let's say, lack of niceties that makes it exciting to watch. But you definitely are looking for drivers that are in durable equipment in a road race as opposed to just necessarily fast, because the drivers that are the fastest on the road courses are usually, it's because of their skill and their ability to maneuver the course, and not necessarily the car's sheer horsepower or downforce. So that's the Sportsbook lesson today on handicapping NASCAR and betting on auto racing. I had some picks for the Daytona 500 that didn't pan out last week, so we didn't really have any official plays because the show never aired. But going forward, I think I may have some NASCAR plays if there's nothing else going on. But we will have the basketball tournament coming up, conference tournaments, and then the NCAA, and that'll give us lots of basketball to talk about before we get into our next football seasons. So very exciting. So let's move on to our Friday night, and we've got 5 games in the NHL, and I want to point out that Monday is the trade deadline in the NHL, and there are players for teams that may not play this weekend because of they do not want to risk injuring them for the trade deadline, trying to make a deal. And let's start with the Blue Jackets at the Senators. There's 2 teams right here that have that exact situation. The Blue Jackets apparently want to part ways with Artemi Panarin, and Bobrovsky, and the Senators have pretty much everybody on the block that's not a kid. So you have the Blue Jackets are a team that's in playoff contention, and the Senators are not. So, you really like the Blue Jackets here. I understand the Senators have actually brought up some minor leaguers for tonight. So I'm staying far away from that. And the Blue Jackets obviously favored. And then you have the Avalanche at the Blackhawks. And here's 2 teams that are fighting for a playoff spot in the West. Blackhawks have been on fire. Patrick Kane, the Buffalo native, is leading scoring race and has just been El Fuego, however you want to say it. The Blackhawks have some decent goaltending with Delia, and I really like the Blackhawks tonight. The Avalanche are, I think they really need to make some moves to be a player in the end of the season here. They have a competitive team, but that's really all they have. They don't really have a world beater, although I do think their goaltending is adequate with Varlamov. But I do like the Blackhawks. They've just been playing so well. Every game matters to them. They are on a path for a playoff spot if they can continue at their current pace. And then you have 2 teams in opposite directions. You have the Wild at the Red Wings. The Red Wings are rebuilding, and they will probably be selling some of their players. But they have a very good young core. They have excellent goaltending with Jimmy Howard. And I don't know if they'll trade him. He's in his later years. And then you have the Wild that has just been floundering. They traded Niederreiter to Carolina, and he's really flourished over there. The Wild has very average to below average goaltending, in my opinion, and they could use a netminder. I think that might turn their season around. But this game, not odds either way that appeal to me. If you gave me the Wild at like plus 130, I'd probably take a chance on them. If you gave me the Red Wings at plus money, I might take a chance on them. But the way that's lined right now, I don't really want to touch it. Then you have the Anaheim Ducks at the Calgary Flames. And the Anaheim Ducks, believe it or not, are only 5 points out of a playoff spot. I think 3 points out of a playoff spot. I have to check the standings, somewhere in that range. And the Flames are a very good team, and I've said before, I feel like they're a Stanley Cup contender. The West is kind of a mess right now. You have 5 or 6 teams fighting for the last playoff spot, with the other wild card maybe only 3 points ahead of them. Ryan Miller has been super this past week. He started 2 games and had a shutout and a 1-goal victory, 1-goal allowed victory. He is now the all-time leading winner of games for U.S.-born goalies. He is 38 years old now, but he apparently is going to be the number 1 guy going forward, and if he's feeling it, he'll probably play tonight. Anaheim playing with absolutely nothing to lose. They have no expectation of being a playoff team, but somehow find themselves in the mix right now. I like Anaheim at that number. Maybe I would take a plus 1 goal here, but they seem to be playing very well. So the value's on Anaheim in this game. And then finally we have the Winnipeg Jets at Vegas Golden Knights. And Vegas, if they're starting Marc-Andre Fleury, you really have to like them. He has just been outstanding. He's been, I would say, arguably the best goalie in the West, if not in the league. But when they start Malcolm Subban, the team just doesn't seem to have it. I'm not saying that Subban gives up soft goals. I'm just saying they don't play as well for him. Either that or Fleury can carry a team. The Winnipeg Jets have been very inconsistent this last month. Have not, they're one of their star players like Patrick Laine, who is leading the league in goals after the first couple of months. He's only had 4 or 5 goals since the first of the year. They seem to be looking to find themselves. I don't feel like they're playing very well right now. That number is just not a high enough number for me to take a flyer on the Jets. They're a team that's certainly capable of beating Vegas, but that would have to be plus 160 for me to take a shot at Winnipeg. And Vegas is also just a little too high. So, again, I don't see value in that game. And we'll see where I end up with my picks. But that's tonight's Friday NHL. And we are going to move on to college hoops tonight. And, of course, there's the Ivy League schedule. And there's 2 top 25 games, and one of them is Indiana at Iowa. Iowa is -7, favorite at home. 144.5 is the over-under. And Indiana is not they're in a rebuilding year, if you want to call it that. They're 13-13, but I think they only have, 3 or 4 conference wins. Iowa, on the other hand, has only 2 losses at home, and they own significant statistical advantages in free throws, 3-point shooting percentage, and rebounding margin. I feel like Iowa can cover this number. I don't know about the total because that's going to depend a lot more on Indiana, but I expect that Iowa could put up 80 tonight. We'll see what happens if they shoot poorly or whatever. But Indiana has had, in their last 10 games, they've had 4 or 5 close games, like 5 points or less. But I think this is a game where it gets away from them. I know that they will want to, come out and give their best effort. But I feel like if Iowa is running like they should cover the 7 points here. And I really like them. And then in the Ivy League tonight, earlier game is Cornell at Princeton, -7, over under 137. And the last show I did for you folks, we talked about Ivy League basketball, and Princeton lost one of their best scorers earlier this year in January. They have been very inconsistent. Princeton has been very inconsistent since they lost that scorer. Both of these teams are 5-3 in the conference. Cornell is about a 500 team overall, but they are shooting better. They have, again, you have a free throw advantage and a 3-point field goal advantage for Cornell. The rebounding margins are about the same. Princeton grabs a few more rebounds a game. That could be more of their system as opposed to just a height advantage. But the rebounding margin is about the same. But Cornell is a better shooting team. And I feel like in the Ivy League, 7 points is a lot. So, Princeton went from 2 weeks ago to being plus 8.5 to -7 at home. They've shot only like 25% from 3 in the last 2 weeks. So I feel like Cornell is the play here with +7. So we'll see what happens tonight. With the total, I would expect that total to lean towards the over. I'm not going to have a play on total. As I've said before, the juice on the totals, you're looking at -115 on both sides. You're paying a lot of vig to the bookmaker, and I don't think that is. I think you're better off playing sides and money lines instead. So let's wrap things up here and take a look at my picks. And I've got 4 for you today. Very light schedule. We have tonight the Blackhawks money line +100. I feel like that they're just feeling it right now, and I'm going to ride the hot streak with them, especially if Delia is in goal tonight. I really like the Blackhawks. I'm going to take the Ducks +1 at +155. They're 203 on the money line. I feel like getting that extra goal is a nice hedge. I expect Ryan Miller in goal tonight. I will see what happens, but they're thinking they still have a shot at the playoffs. So we'll see what happens, but I'm going to hedge with the +1 goal there. And then Cornell +7, like I said, they're just playing better than Princeton. Hopefully they don't throw up a total stinker, but if they can keep it competitive, I think they'll cover. And then finally, Iowa -7. That game's after 9 o'clock. I expect it to be a running game. I'm not sure if Indiana will try to play half court with them or not, but that would be a big mistake. The more points Iowa puts up, the more likely they're going to cover that 7 points. So that's it for today's show. I do want to say something quickly about the AAF, or the Alliance of American Football. I was going to start handicapping that for you, and I think it's a fun concept, and I think the league is well designed. There's a couple of issues. Number one, there is not any historical stats to go on for both game strategy and for player stats. Number two is there are not very high limits. High enough for me, obviously, if you're starting out betting and you're betting, $30-$50 a game, or anything under 100, you certainly don't have to worry about that. But the sports books do not want to take much risk on these games. And then third of all, it is the issue with the fact that the league failed to make payroll after the second week, and they had to get an infusion of cash. The owner of the Carolina Hurricanes hockey team bought into the league for $250 million, if you didn't read that. And I just think that I want to wait and see how this league pans out this year, I think, before. If it looks like it's going to stick, I feel like it'll be worth pursuing next year when we have a season full of stats. It's not completely equitable a league because of the way the players' rights are designed. A small fact about the league is that each team is assigned 4 NFL teams that they can draw talent from, and so it's not, they don't get even picks. There's no draft type of thing. So if they get teams that have very good development systems, they're going to get good players. And also I want to say that I believe that the quality of the CFL is much closer to the NFL than this league is. Not to say that couldn't change over time, but I'm going to wait and see on that. So that's going to do it for today's show. And next week I'm planning on trying to do a catch-up on all kinds of gambling news. Lots of interesting stories as we get closer and closer. We're about a month away from being able to have sports betting here in the Finger Lakes, and I expect the casino will not waste any time in getting a sports book up and running once that 60-day period is over around March 28th. And that'll be just in time for the first couple of second and third rounds of the NCAA basketball tournament, and maybe we can do something out there at the sports book one of these days. So interesting times, and maybe something really nice will happen for us, so we will see what happens. So I'm going to play the outro music for you. Hope we get some winners. Thanks for watching. Tune in again. Take care, everybody.